Silas Thorne replayed the security footage for the 5th time. Timestamp. 2:47 a.m. There she was, Tessa Harlow, the chef from Texas, moving through his kitchen like a ghost, wrapping something in a towel and hiding it under her coat, hands shaking. He'd suspected her for 3 weeks. Wagyu beef gone, truffle vanished, bone broth missing every other night. Mrs. Pemberton, his head housekeeper, had laid it out clearly. She's desperate, selling to restaurants to pay off debts. It made sense. Tessa was an outsider with no one. But something in Silas's chest twisted. He'd wanted to be wrong. She disappeared toward the west wing, the forbidden corridor. His mother's room. One phone call and she'd be gone forever. His finger reached for the phone, but something made him wait. His mother's bedroom camera activated. Catherine Thorne appeared on screen. Skeletal. Silk pajamas hanging like a burial shroud. Silver hair limp around a hollow face. Tessa entered the frame, knelt beside her, opened a thermos. Steam rose. Catherine's eyes came alive. Hungry. Desperate. Tessa brought a spoon of golden broth to the old woman's cracked lips. Catherine opened her mouth like a starving bird. Silas couldn't breathe. He watched Tessa feed his mother with a gentleness he'd never witnessed in his world, wiping her chin between spoonfuls, whispering words that made Catherine cry. The old woman ate everything, then gripped Tessa's wrist like she was afraid the food would disappear. Then he saw it, the dinner tray on the dresser. The meal Pemberton's staff claimed Catherine refused. It was empty. Not untouched. Empty. It never held food. He pulled up earlier footage, watched Pemberton carry that tray in, watched her lean close to his mother and speak. No audio, but he read her lips. Still being difficult, Catherine? You'll eat when you've learned some respect. Ice turned to fire. He cycled back a week. 2 weeks. A month. Same pattern every day. Empty trays. His mother begging. Staff bringing nothing. Nurse Gretchen writing stable while Catherine starved. Tessa, who everyone thought was stealing to survive, was stealing to keep his mother alive. Silas's hands shook. Hands that had broken men. Hands that built an empire. He trusted Pemberton completely. Delegated his mother's care because he told himself he was too busy. The truth was uglier. He was afraid to watch her fade, so he handed her to strangers. And they'd been killing her slowly, right under his nose. On screen, Tessa braided Catherine's hair, the old woman's face soft with something Silas hadn't seen in months. Peace. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now settle in, because nothing here is what it seems. 3 weeks earlier, Tessa Harlow stood in the middle of the Thorne Estate's industrial kitchen, her hands shaking without stopping. Her only suitcase sat out in the hallway, leaning against the gray stone wall like an abandoned child. And in her bank account she had exactly $43 left. The kitchen was 3 times larger than any professional kitchen she'd ever worked in Austin or Dallas. Stainless steel gleamed under cold fluorescent lights. 2 high-powered Viking ranges stood side by side like sentries. The walk-in refrigerator was so large it could fit a car. Bright steel prep tables lined up in orderly rows like an operating room. And silence. Not the silence of too few people, but the silence of too much hostility. 7 kitchen staff stood scattered around their stations, each in their place, but all of them looked at her the same way, as if she'd walked through a door no one had opened for her, as if she were a stain on their flawless stainless steel. Their eyes slid over Tessa's chef coat, the only thing she still owned that looked even remotely decent, then turned away with a contempt they didn't bother to hide. No one said hello. No one nodded. She stood there in that vast kitchen and felt smaller than she'd ever felt. Miss Harlow. The voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Tessa turned and saw a woman in her 60s standing in the doorway. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress, her silver hair pinned into a neat bun, without a single strand out of place, her back straight as iron. Everything about her radiated authority, from the way she stood to the way the 7 kitchen employees lowered their heads in unison when she appeared. I'm Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper of this estate. I oversee all household operations, including the kitchen. You'll report directly to me. Yes, ma'am. Tessa forced her voice to hold steady. Mrs. Pemberton didn't offer a single additional word of welcome. She turned, motioned for Tessa to follow, and began leading her through the long corridors of the Thorne estate with steps that were quick and precise. She indicated the staff quarters, the laundry room, the storage areas, the family's dining space, the main dining room, and at each place she stopped only long enough to deliver one brief sentence before moving on. Tessa had to almost jog to keep up. Then they reached the west wing. The corridor here was entirely different. The light was softer, the carpet thicker, and the air heavier, as if even dust didn't dare drift into this part of the house. Mrs. Pemberton stopped. She said nothing. She simply stood there for a second, then slowly turned to look at Tessa. Her eyes were so cold, Tessa felt the temperature in the hallway drop by a few degrees. There was no warning, no explanation, no rule spoken aloud. Only that look. Then Mrs. Pemberton turned away and continued on as if that moment had never happened. But Tessa understood, as clearly as if the woman had shouted in her face, "Never step in here." Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Pemberton introduced Tessa to Hugo Pratt, the head chef. He was a large man in his 40s, his arms as thick as an ordinary person's thighs, and he looked Tessa up and down with the kind of gaze people reserve for an insect crawling onto a dinner table. "She's the new one." Hugo didn't speak to Tessa. He spoke to Mrs. Pemberton, as if Tessa weren't even in the room. Mrs. Pemberton nodded and left without looking back. Hugo pointed toward the sink. "The vegetables in that bin need to be washed clean. The kitchen floor gets mopped every 2 hours. The trash gets taken out when it reaches the red line." Tessa looked at him. She'd been hired as a chef, but she didn't say a word. She nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and began washing the vegetables. That evening, after her first 16-hour shift, Tessa stood by the kitchen window while she waited for water to boil so she could wash the last pot. From there, she could see the west wing, the 3rd floor, large windows with the curtains drawn tight. The lights were off even though it was only 8 o'clock at night. All day, she hadn't seen anyone go in or out of that area except Mrs. Pemberton. No doctors, no nurse shift changes, no murmured conversation. Only a thick, smothering silence draped over the west wing like a burial cloth. Something was wrong in that place. Tessa could feel it with an instinct she couldn't explain. The kind of instinct that lives in the bones of people who have cared for the sick, who have sat beside someone's bed and watched them grow weaker day by day. She couldn't name the feeling yet, but it was there, quietly gnawing behind every thought, like an unhealed wound she kept brushing by accident. On her first night at the Thorne estate, Tessa lay on a narrow single bed in the smallest room in the staff quarters, pressed up against the laundry room. The dryer turned with a steady rhythm through the thin wall, a soft vibration that traveled into the bed frame, into her bones, into the thoughts she'd tried to bury for months, but tonight they dug themselves back up. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't sleep. The ceiling was low. The sharp scent of industrial detergent had soaked into everything, and in the dark, Tessa found herself pulled backward to Austin, to the small kitchen where her mother, Margaret Harlow, used to stand every night after 2 back-to-back shifts, sautéing onions in an old cast-iron skillet. Margaret was all Tessa had. Her father, a construction worker named Ray Harlow, died when Tessa was 8, a scaffolding collapse at a job site south of Austin. She didn't remember much about that day except the dust-caked work boots someone brought home and set by the door, and the sound of her mother crying in the kitchen all night, then getting up the next morning and going to work as if nothing had happened. Margaret didn't fall apart. She took extra shifts at a second restaurant, serving breakfasts in the morning, washing dishes at the Mexican place down the street at night, and between those shifts, she taught Tessa how to cook, not from books or written recipes, but by touch. She guided Tessa's hand to the side of a pot so she could feel the heat. She covered her eyes and made her taste, made her smell, made her guess each spice. "Cooking isn't a job, honey," Margaret used to say. "Cooking is how you tell people you care about them, without having to open your mouth." Tessa carried that sentence into culinary school, then into the kitchen of a well-known restaurant in Dallas, where she became sous chef at 24. The future opened wide. Critics began to mention her name. The head chef said she had gifted hands. Everything Margaret had sacrificed was finally starting to bear fruit. Then the call from the Austin hospital came on a Tuesday morning. Her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. Tessa turned in her resignation that afternoon. Not a second of hesitation. She went back to Austin, moved into the small house where she'd grown up, and became Margaret's only caregiver for the next 14 months. 14 months of chemotherapy. 14 months of spoon-feeding porridge, wiping her down, changing sheets, reading aloud when her mother couldn't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. 14 months of watching the strongest woman she'd ever known shrink day by day, like a candle burning in the wind. Margaret died on an October night, quietly, in her sleep, with Tessa holding her hand. After the funeral, Tessa sat at the kitchen table and opened the stack of bills. $87,000 in medical debt. The house mortgaged. Savings at 0. She sold the house, paid part of it down, and the rest became collection calls that arrived every day, as steady as an alarm clock. She lived in her car for 3 winter months, applying for jobs in hundreds of places. No one called back. A 14-month gap on her resume, no recent references, and the restaurant world didn't wait for anyone. Then one night, sitting in her car parked behind a Walmart, Tessa scrolled on her phone and saw a posting, "Private chef for a Chicago estate." The pay was so high she had to read it twice. No reference letters required. No demand for an unbroken work history. Only 2 conditions: cook well, and know how to stay quiet. Anyone with a little life experience knew that when a job paid too much and asked too few questions, there was always something behind it that they didn't want her to see. Tessa knew that. She wasn't stupid, but she was sitting in a car in the heart of a Chicago winter with her last $43, and a drowning person doesn't get picky about a lifeline. The first week at the Thorne estate passed like a test of endurance no one bothered to explain to Tessa, a trial where the rules were never spoken out loud. Hugo Pratt never gave her anything that resembled real cooking. Wash the vegetables, peel the potatoes, mop the kitchen floor every 2 hours, take out the trash, haul crates of ingredients from the delivery truck into the walk-in refrigerator. Work that anyone who'd never held a chef's knife for a single day could do, and Hugo knew it. He handed it to her each morning with a thin, pale smile, like a daily ritual meant to remind her that she didn't belong here. The rest of the kitchen staff fell in line quickly. Tessa's tools disappeared from her station when she turned her back, then reappeared in the wrong drawer, or didn't reappear at all. The staff meal at lunch was always gone before her turn came, and no one remembered to save her a plate. Tessa ate whatever scraps were left on the prep tables after service. Leftover bits of vegetables, a few slices of dry bread, sometimes nothing but water, and she'd wait until the next shift. She didn't complain. Not once. She'd lived in her car for 3 winter months, eaten icy canned food in a Walmart parking lot at midnight. Compared to those days, eating leftovers in a $1 million kitchen was still an improvement. She kept her head down, she worked, and she kept her mouth shut. But her eyes didn't. Tessa watched everything with the quiet instinct of someone used to living on the edge, used to seeing without being seen. She noticed small things no one in this house seemed to notice anymore, because they'd become normal. No one mentioned Catherine Thorne, not ever. The mistress of the house's name didn't appear in any conversation in the kitchen, in the staff rooms, in the hallways. As if she didn't exist. As if the 3rd floor of the West Wing was an empty room, not a place where a human being was living. Nurse Gretchen Marsh, a brown-haired woman in her 50s with a professional smile always fixed on her mouth, went up to the 3rd floor twice a day, but each time she stayed no longer than 20 minutes. When she came back down, she always locked the nurse's station door behind her with 2 locks before going anywhere, even if she was only stepping out to smoke. And Mrs. Pemberton. She controlled everything that went in and out of the West Wing with the precision of a jailer. The meal trays went up in her hands. The bed linens were changed and arranged by her hands. The medical visits were approved by her. No staff member was allowed onto the 3rd floor without her direct permission, and through that entire first week Tessa watched. Not a single person ever asked. Everyone in this house seemed to have accepted an unwritten law. The West Wing was Pemberton's private kingdom, and no one questioned what happened inside. On the 5th night, Tessa was lying in her room when she heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Slow, steady, coming toward her door. Her heart leapt up into her throat. She jolted upright, her back pressed to the wall, her eyes fixed on the doorknob. The knob turned. The door opened. A laundry worker stood there, arms full of folded sheets, eyes half asleep. Sorry, wrong room. The door shut again. The footsteps faded. Tessa sat in the dark with her heart still pounding, and she reminded herself of what she'd been trying to forget since the day she stepped into this place. She was living in the house of a man the entire city of Chicago feared, and her safety depended completely on whether she could make herself invisible enough. The 8th night, Tessa was lying there, waiting for sleep to come, when she heard it. Not through the wall, not from the hallway, but through the small ventilation grill above the corner of her room, connected straight into the kitchen's ventilation system. The sound was so faint it was almost swallowed by the steady turning of the dryer beside her, but Tessa heard it. Clearly. Exactly. Because she'd heard that sound every night for 14 months, sitting beside her mother's bed in the small house in Austin, crying, weak, exhausted, pressed down by someone who no longer had the strength to cry out loud. The crying of a person dying slowly. On the 9th night, the crying came again. Same hour, same volume, the same desperation compressed until it nearly became silence. Tessa lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening as the sound slipped through the ventilation duct and fell into her small room like drops of water on stone. She could have closed her eyes. She could have pulled the blanket over her head, pressed a pillow to her ears, and pretended she heard nothing, that it was the wind, the pipes, anything but the cry of a human being. She could have reminded herself of what hung over her head. Being caught in the West Wing meant breaking the one rule Mrs. Pemberton had made unmistakably clear with her eyes on the very first day. Breaking it meant losing her job. Losing her job meant going back to a car in the middle of a Chicago winter, with $87,000 in debt and nowhere left to go. Tessa knew all of that. She knew it with reason, with logic, with the part of the brain designed for survival, but her body refused to turn away. Her feet touched the cold floor before her mind could order them to stop. She pulled on her coat, opened the door so slowly that every millimeter of the hinges stayed silent, and stepped into the dark hallway. The Thorne estate at night was a different world. By day it was vast and intimidating, but at least there was light, footsteps, signs of life. At night it became a labyrinth of stone and oak, where every shadow had shape and every echo stretched twice as long. Tessa walked barefoot to avoid making a sound. She had watched carefully over the past week and knew where the security cameras were in the main corridors. But she didn't know whether there were cameras in the West Wing hallway. She didn't know whether someone was sitting in front of a screen right now, watching her. She only knew the crying was pulling her forward, and she was following it. The West Wing sat at the end of the second-floor corridor, beyond a heavy wooden door that led to a private staircase. The door was unlocked. That detail made Tessa pause for a second. Mrs. Pemberton, who controlled everything going in and out of this area like a prison warden, hadn't locked it, because she didn't need to. No one in this house dared come here. The fear she'd planted was more effective than any lock. Tessa pushed the door and stepped onto the stairs. The staircase was narrow, the thick carpet swallowing every footstep. At the third floor, she found a short hallway with 2 doors. The crying came from the last one. She stopped in front of it, placed her hand on the knob, and turned it. The room opened before her, and it took several seconds for Tessa's mind to process the contradiction between what she saw and what she felt. Champagne-colored silk curtains, polished mahogany furniture reflecting the moonlight slipping through a narrow gap, a hospital bed with gleaming steel rails, and an electronic control system. Everything in the room was expensive, flawless, and so cold it felt like stepping into a luxury funeral home. And on the bed, half sitting, half lying, was Catherine Thorne. Tessa had seen what it looked like when death moved close to a person. She had watched her mother shrink day by day for 14 months. But Margaret had at least been fed, cared for, had someone holding her hand. Catherine Thorne looked forgotten. The silk pajamas hung from her skeletal frame, condensed into the shape of a person. Her collarbones jutted like wooden beams beneath her skin. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and tears ran down both temples into the pillow without sound, as if even crying had been done so many times it had become a silent reflex. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Tessa's voice came out softer than she intended. Catherine startled and turned her head. The gray eyes that had been empty flared with pure fear. Not fear of a stranger in the room, but fear because she thought she knew who had sent her. "Mrs. Pemberton sent you, didn't she?" Catherine's voice was hoarse, torn like old paper. "No, I'm Tessa, the new chef. I heard you crying." Catherine stared at her for a long time, so long it felt as if she were trying to decide whether Tessa was real or a hallucination from an exhausted mind. Then she spoke, and the 3 words pierced Tessa's chest harder than anything she had ever heard in her life. "I'm hungry. I'm so hungry." Tessa looked around the room. On the mahogany dresser beside the bed sat the silver tray Mrs. Pemberton brought up every evening. Tessa stepped closer. The tray was empty, completely empty. No plate, no glass, not a crumb of bread, not a trace of food. It had never held a meal. Her stomach was empty. The tray was empty. Her eyes were empty. This $1,000,000 room was empty. "Please don't tell her." Catherine clutched the edge of Tessa's sleeve with fingers thin as twigs, and in her pleading voice was a deep fear Tessa recognized instantly. This wasn't the fear of illness. This was the fear of prey toward a hunter. "Please, don't tell." And in that moment, every scattered piece Tessa had collected over the past week, the always spotless trays, the door no one dared cross, the name Catherine no one dared speak, Nurse Gretchen with the door always locked twice, all of it snapped together into a picture so clear it made her nauseous. This was not a patient refusing to eat. This was a 74-year-old woman being systematically starved in her own home. Tessa left Catherine's room at 3 o'clock in the morning. She went down the stairs, through the corridor, back to the kitchen. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were different from when she'd gone up. There was no fear left in them, no hesitation. In her gaze was something anyone who had cared for a loved one until their final breath would recognize. The resolve of someone who knew exactly what had to be done. Tessa stepped into the kitchen, turned on the small light above the sink, and opened the refrigerator. Inside the Thorne Estates industrial refrigerator at 3 o'clock in the morning, Tessa didn't look for any high-end ingredients she dared not touch. The wagyu, the truffles, the imported seafood, all of it was inventoried daily by Hugo and reported directly to Mrs. Pemberton. But Tessa didn't need any of that. She needed what no one in this kitchen even bothered to look at. Cold rice from the staff dinner, half a pot left, destined to be dumped in the morning. Chicken bones already picked clean, sitting in a plastic bag at the top of the trash, waiting to be thrown out. A few limp scallions and wilted ginger in the produce drawer that Hugo had marked for discard. Tessa took it all out, set it on the prep table, and began to cook. She simmered the chicken bones with ginger over a low flame, skimming the foam, watching the heat, coaxing the broth into something clear and naturally sweet. She cooked porridge from the cold rice, stirring steadily until the grains softened and opened, melting into the broth until it became a smooth, thickened mixture. that gave off a gentle, comforting steam. Food for someone who'd been starved for a long time couldn't be heavy. It couldn't be greasy. It couldn't be hard. Tessa knew this from 14 months caring for her mother. A stomach that had shrunk from hunger needed to be awakened slowly, tenderly, like calling someone from sleep, not jolting them awake. She poured the porridge into the old thermos she'd brought from Austin, the only thing left from her mother's kitchen, then slipped back up to the west wing for the second time that night. Catherine was still awake. When Tessa stepped in and twisted off the lid, steam rose with the scent of chicken and ginger, and Catherine's gray eyes widened, but she didn't reach for it. She drew in on herself, stared at the bedroom door, then at Tessa, then back at the door again. If she finds out. Catherine's voice shook so badly the sentence broke in half. She won't find out. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, scooped a spoonful, blew softly, then held it at Catherine's mouth. And even if she does, you need to eat. Catherine looked at the spoon, looked at Tessa, then she opened her mouth, and when the first spoonful touched her tongue, when the warm taste of chicken and ginger slid down a throat that had been dry for weeks, Catherine Thorne cried. Not the faint crying Tessa had heard through the ventilation duct. This was the crying of someone who'd finally been seen after a long time of being treated as if she didn't exist. Tears ran down her chin, fell into the spoon, and still she ate. She ate through the tears, through the hitching breaths, until the thermos was empty, and she sank back onto the pillow, exhausted. But for the first time in weeks, exhausted from being full, not from being hungry. That night became the first night in a string of nights that followed. Every evening after the kitchen closed, Tessa gathered what was about to be thrown away. Beef bones, wilted vegetables, cold rice, scraps of meat still clinging to a tray, the things that would be in the trash by morning. She turned them into porridge, into soup, into broth, then carried them up to the west wing when the clock struck 2 o'clock in the morning. Slowly, Catherine began to wait for her. She sat up in bed when she heard the door open, her eyes bright in the darkness, and Tessa realized it wasn't only the food, it was that someone came. Between the late-night meals, Catherine began to tell stories. Her voice was still hoarse, but each night it grew a little clearer, a little stronger, like a small flame fed with new wood. She spoke of Conrad Thorne, her husband, the man who had built everything with his bare hands, and loved her with a rough, unwavering devotion. She spoke of Silas as a boy, the child who had nightmares and could only sleep when she sang, the child who'd become a man the whole city feared, yet in her eyes he was still a boy who needed comfort. She spoke of this house when it was full of laughter, when the great dining room overflowed with guests every holiday, when the kitchen where Tessa worked had once smelled of apple pie. Catherine herself baked every Sunday. Tessa listened, braided her hair, wiped her face with a warm cloth, and stayed beside her until Catherine drifted into sleep. Then one night, about 2 weeks after that first time, Catherine said something Tessa never expected. She controls my will. Catherine's voice was a whisper, but it was unusually clear. Pemberton. She forced me to sign a power of attorney and change the inheritance terms when I was still lucid, when I still had the strength to hold a pen. And after that, she told Silas I had dementia. Catherine turned to look at Tessa, and in those gray eyes there was no paranoia, no confusion, only the sharp clarity of a woman who knew exactly what was being done to her and was helpless to stop it. She told my son, I've lost my mind. I haven't lost my mind. I'm just being starved. Tessa sat very still. The blood in her body ran cold. The last pieces dropped into place with a distinct click inside her head. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't busy staff forgetting to care for an old woman. This was a calculated scheme, systematic, with a clear financial purpose. Pemberton was killing Catherine Thorne slowly by starving her. And when she died, she would die on paper as a dementia patient who had lost the will to live, and the entire estate would flow into the hands of the people Pemberton had already arranged. And Tessa, the debt-burdened chef from Texas, no one in this house bothered to look at, was the only person on earth who knew the truth. She kept bringing food up every night. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. But there was one thing Tessa didn't know. Something she couldn't know because she wasn't the owner of the $1 million security system in this house. In the walls and ceilings of the industrial kitchen, hidden in corners the naked eye would never notice, electronic eyes had recorded every one of her night trips, every time she opened the refrigerator, every time she wrapped the thermos in a kitchen towel and slipped into the hallway. The cameras had seen everything, and it was only a matter of time before someone sat down and watched. Mrs. Pemberton noticed that something was wrong in the 3rd week, not because of any single incident, but because of the accumulation of small changes. Her sharp eyes never missed. Catherine was eating more during the day. Not much, but enough to swallow a few sips of water when Gretchen brought it. Enough that her eyes were no longer completely sunken the way they had been 2 weeks earlier. Catherine was speaking. When Mrs. Pemberton entered the West Wing bedroom each morning to perform the ritual she called care, Catherine no longer lay still staring at the ceiling like a breathing corpse. She sat up. She looked Pemberton straight in the eye. And worst of all, Catherine asked about Silas. When is my son coming to visit? The question echoed in the West Wing bedroom on a Wednesday morning, and Mrs. Pemberton felt something cold slide down her spine. Not fear. Mrs. Pemberton was not afraid of Catherine. She was afraid of what Catherine's recovery meant. 3 weeks earlier, Catherine had been dying exactly according to plan. Weak, silent, compliant. On paper, a dementia patient refusing food and losing the will to live. Everything had been proceeding perfectly. And now, suddenly, the 74-year-old woman everyone assumed was fading away was sitting up and asking after her son. Someone was interfering. Mrs. Pemberton spent that afternoon in her housekeeper's office, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. She had access to the security cameras in the kitchen, the first-floor hallways, the staff areas, and the exterior grounds. That was the scope Silas had granted her to oversee household operations. She did not have access to the third-floor West Wing cameras. That system was under Silas's direct control. Separate codes, separate servers, and she had never dared ask. But the kitchen cameras were enough. She rewound the footage from the past 3 nights and saw exactly what she needed to see. 2:17 in the morning, Tessa Harlow entered the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, took out bones, cold rice, vegetable scraps, cooked at the small burner for about 40 minutes, poured the contents into a thermos, wrapped the thermos in a kitchen towel, hid it under her coat, and disappeared from the kitchen camera frame. The next night, the same pattern. The night after that, identical. Mrs. Pemberton replayed the footage again and again, watching Tessa take items from the refrigerator, unable to see where she carried them because the West Wing hallway cameras were outside her access. She did not know Tessa was feeding Catherine. She only knew that the Texas chef was taking food from the kitchen every night and carrying it somewhere inside the estate. And for Mrs. Pemberton, that was all she needed. Not the truth, but the raw material to build a better story than the truth. She opened the inventory ledger on her computer, the system she herself managed, entered, and reported to Silas every month. She began to edit. Discard-bound chicken bones became several pounds of premium Wagyu beef. Leftover rice became imported white truffles from Italy. Wilted vegetables became high-end seafood. Each night Tessa took scraps. Mrs. Pemberton added a new figure to the loss column, and after 3 weeks, the total value of the missing goods reached into the thousands of dollars. A perfect theft record. Clean, systematic, supported by camera footage, supported by detailed figures, without a single visible flaw. The following afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton went to see Silas in his second-floor office. She knocked exactly twice, entered with a neatly clipped folder in her hands, and wore the expression she had practiced in the mirror. Worried, sorrowful, reluctant, like someone forced to deliver bad news she wished she did not have to speak. "Mr. Thorne, there is something I need to report." Her voice was low, weighted. "It concerns Miss Harlow." Silas sat behind his desk, his eyes moving over the documents Pemberton placed in front of him. Inventory reports, camera notes, itemized lists of missing ingredients with precise values. "I did not want to believe this, sir." Pemberton shook her head slightly, her voice trembling just enough. "I tried to find another explanation, but numbers do not lie. Miss Harlow has been systematically stealing ingredients, Wagyu, truffles, premium bone stock, every night, without fail. Perhaps she is selling them to outside restaurants to pay off debts." Silas did not look up. He turned the pages slowly, his face unreadable. Then he closed the folder. "I will handle it." 3 words, flat, no anger, no surprise, just cold. Mrs. Pemberton nodded, stood, offered a few more words of regret, and left the office. She walked down the second-floor hallway with steady steps, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead, and when she turned the corner, certain she was out of sight from Silas's office, the corner of her mouth lifted into a smile. Small, precise, satisfied, the smile of someone who had just placed the final piece on the board. What Mrs. Pemberton did not know was that the hallway corner was not empty. Barrett Cole, Silas's closest lieutenant, was leaning against the wall a few steps away, phone in hand, pretending to read a message. He did not speak. He did not look directly at her, but he saw that smile, and he remembered it. That night, when the estate sank into darkness and everyone had gone to their rooms, Silas Thorne sat alone in the second-floor security monitoring room. He powered up 12 screens, selected the kitchen cameras and the hallway feeds, adjusted the angles, then leaned back in his chair and waited. He believed he was hunting a thief, a desperate chef from Texas, stealing expensive ingredients to sell on the side and pay off debts. Simple, clean, easy to end with a single phone call. He did not know that in the hours to come, what appeared on those 12 screens would shatter everything he had believed for 22 years, and that what he was about to discover would be worse than theft by orders of magnitude beyond measure. The next morning, Tessa walked into the kitchen at 5:30, like she did every day. She hadn't slept much. 3 hours, maybe 4, but she was used to it. 3 weeks of cooking during the day and slipping food up to the West Wing at night had turned exhaustion into her new normal. She tied her hair back, put on her chef coat, washed her hands, and started prepping breakfast ingredients according to the list Hugo had left on the table the night before. The kitchen was empty. The other staff hadn't arrived yet. There was only the steady hum of the ventilation fan and the fluorescent light reflecting on steel. An ordinary morning. At least, that was what Tessa thought. Mrs. Pemberton passed through the kitchen at 6:15. That wasn't unusual, because she always inspected the kitchen in the morning before going up to the West Wing. But instead of gliding past Tessa without looking the way she always did, she stopped, and she smiled. "You look refreshed this morning, Miss Harlow." Her tone was gentle, almost friendly, and that was exactly what made Tessa feel as if someone had poured ice water down her spine. In the past 3 weeks, Mrs. Pemberton had never smiled at Tessa. She had never spoken her name with anything other than cold distance. That smile was wrong. Completely wrong. Like flowers blooming in winter on a dead branch. Beautiful, but so unnatural her instincts screamed that something was coming. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." Tessa forced her voice to stay normal and kept slicing onions. "Mrs." Pemberton lingered for a few more seconds, her eyes moving over Tessa from head to toe, as if measuring a coffin, then turned away. Her footsteps were light and even on the stone floor, each step echoing and then vanishing into the corridor, and Tessa realized her hand was gripping the knife handle so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 20 minutes later, Barrett Cole walked into the kitchen. Silas's closest lieutenant rarely appeared in this part of the house. He belonged to the second floor, to boardrooms, to quiet phone calls behind closed doors. He had no reason to be standing in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes moving around as if he were checking something. But he was here, and when his gaze met Tessa's, he didn't look away right away. He looked at her, longer than normal. Not with Hugo's contempt, not with the other staff's indifference. Barrett's look was something Tessa couldn't read, hovering on the line between curiosity and compassion, or perhaps a warning. Then he gave a small nod, almost invisible, turned, and left without saying a word. Tessa stood in the middle of the kitchen with the knife in her hand, and the sense that the ground beneath her feet was shifting. At noon, when all the staff were eating in the break room, Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway. She didn't step inside. She simply stood there, and her presence alone was enough to silence every voice. Announcement. "Mr. Thorne requires everyone to be present in the grand dining room tonight." Her voice was clear, slow, each word pronounced with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the sentence before speaking it. No exceptions. Then she turned and walked away. The break room went quiet. Tessa looked around and saw what she had never seen in the past 3 weeks. Fear on the faces of people who had treated her like air. Hugo set his spoon down, his eyes locked on the tabletop. 2 kitchen workers exchanged a quick glance, then lowered their heads. Gretchen, sitting in the corner, rose quietly and left without finishing her meal. No one said a word, but everyone understood that when Silas Thorne summoned the entire staff to the grand dining room, it was never dinner. Tessa didn't know that. She didn't know that tonight wasn't a meal. It was a trial, and she was the one on trial. 7 o'clock in the evening. The grand dining room of the Thorne estate opened before Tessa like a courtroom gallery. A long oak table with 20 seats dominated the center of the room, its surface polished until it mirrored the light from the crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. On the east wall, a large oil portrait of Conrad Thorne looked down with stern eyes, and Tessa had the strange sensation that even the dead were waiting to see what came next. Everyone was present. The 7 kitchen staff sat along one side of the table, Hugo Pratt at the head of their cluster, his face hard as stone. The household staff, 4 of them, sat together in silence. Gretchen Marsh sat apart, hands on her lap, fingers tapping lightly against her knee as if keeping time to a song only she could hear. Dolores Vance, the assistant housekeeper, sat beside Mrs. Pemberton's empty seat, back straight, eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. 3 of Silas's lieutenants sat near the far end of the table, Barrett Cole among them, his face unreadable, while his eyes swept the room again and again like a security camera. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the most honored position, immediately to the right of the head chair reserved for Silas. She wore black as always, her silver hair pinned into a flawless bun, her back straight, and on her face was an expression Tessa could only describe as absolute confidence. She looked like someone who already knew the verdict and was merely waiting for the formalities to play out. Tessa stood at the end of the table. No one invited her to sit. She clasped her hands behind her back to hide the shaking and tried to keep her knees from giving way. She didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but Mrs. Pemberton's smile that morning, Barrett's look, the frightening quiet that had filled the house all afternoon, All of it pointed in one direction, and that direction pointed straight at her. Silas Thorne entered the room and everything stopped. Not in a figurative way, in a literal way. Whispers died. Chair legs stopped creaking. It felt as if even breathing ceased. He wore a black suit without a tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the top. His eyes were red, the red of a man who had been awake all night, yet every step he placed on the stone floor was precise, deliberate, weighted with the authority of someone used to commanding an empire. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table with one hand on the back of the chair, and he looked at everyone in the room. Slowly, one face at a time, like he was reading a book whose ending he already knew. "We have a problem." His voice was calm. So calm it was more frightening than any shout. "There is a thief in this house." Every gaze in the room shifted toward Tessa. She felt them, each one, like needles pressed into skin. Hugo glanced at her and looked away fast. Gretchen lowered her eyes. The kitchen staff murmured, too soft to make out, but loud enough for Tessa to know they were talking about her. Mrs. Pemberton gave a small nod, almost unconscious, but Tessa saw it. The nod of someone satisfied that everything was unfolding according to the script. Mrs. Pemberton. Silas turned toward the head housekeeper, his voice still flat. "Would you present your findings to everyone?" Mrs. Pemberton rose, slowly, formally, like the key witness stepping up to testify. She took the folder she had prepared, opened it, and began to speak in a heavy, pained voice. The voice of someone forced to reveal a truth she wished did not exist. "Over the past 3 weeks, I have observed a serious decline in our ingredient inventory." She turned pages, read numbers aloud. Grade A Wagyu, imported white truffles, high-end ingredients worth thousands of dollars disappearing systematically. I reviewed the kitchen security cameras. She paused, looked at Tessa, and her face wore a perfectly staged expression of pity. "The footage shows Miss Harlow taking items from the kitchen at night, repeatedly, regularly. I know she has been struggling financially, and I sympathize. But theft is theft." She set the folder down and sat again, back straight, eyes forward, a perfect picture of wounded loyalty. The room fell silent. Silas turned to Tessa. His eyes met hers, and Tessa searched his gaze for any sign of what was waiting for her. But Silas Thorne's eyes were a wall of steel. Nothing came out. Nothing went in. "Is this true, Miss Harlow?" Tessa swallowed. She could lie. She could deny it. She could invent a story. But she was too tired to lie, and the truth was simpler. "I have taken food from the kitchen at night." "Yes." A low hiss of whispers ran around the table like electricity. Hugo folded his arms. Gretchen released a breath. Mrs. Pemberton lifted her chin just slightly, just enough to say everything. "There," she said, her voice gentle but firm as a judge's gavel. "She admits it." The room's murmurs grew louder. Tessa felt the floor sliding away beneath her feet. She thought of her car in the Walmart parking lot, of the freezing nights, of $87,000 in debt, of everything waiting for her outside the iron gates of this estate. Then Silas raised one hand, a small gesture, but the effect was immediate. Every sound in the room vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. Absolute silence. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Harlow," Silas said, and his voice was still flat, still unreadable. "Now, let me show everyone this." Silas stepped to the side, and behind him, on the wall opposite Conrad Thorne's portrait, a large screen Tessa had never seen before lit up. It had been hidden behind a wood panel, and now that panel slid aside to reveal a glossy black surface that covered nearly half the wall. Silas held a small remote in his hand, and when he pressed the first button, the dining room became a movie theater. The first footage was the West Wing hallway, shot from above. Mrs. Pemberton entered the frame, back straight, a silver tray in her hands. She moved down the corridor with the steady pace of someone performing an everyday task, pushed open Catherine's door, and went in. The camera switched to the bedroom angle. The image was sharp down to the smallest detail. "Mrs." Pemberton set the tray on the dresser, then leaned close to Catherine's face. There was no sound, but none was needed. Silas hit pause at the exact moment Mrs. Pemberton's mouth was open, and everyone in the dining room could read the words on her lips with perfect clarity. "Still being difficult, Catherine. You'll eat when you've learned some respect." Silas pressed play. "Mrs." Pemberton straightened, turned, and left the room. The silver tray remained on the dresser, empty. Catherine lay on the bed with her eyes shut, tears running down her temples, her mouth moving again and again around a single word anyone could understand. "Please, please, please." Tessa heard someone inhale sharply across the table. "Mrs." Pemberton sat motionless, her face unchanged, but her hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The second clip. Gretchen Marsh walked into Catherine's room in her nurse's uniform, clipboard in hand. She checked blood pressure, took temperature, wrote notes. On the screen, Catherine was shaking. Not a slight tremor, but full body shaking. the kind that comes when a body has been drained of energy until it can no longer keep itself warm. Gretchen watched Catherine shake, looked straight at the old woman dying in front of her, then lowered her eyes to the clipboard and wrote. Silas zoomed in. Gretchen's handwriting filled the screen, large enough for the entire room to read. Patient stable. Refusing food. No significant change. At the far end of the table, the real Gretchen Marsh sat watching herself on the screen, and her face shifted from white to gray, as if the blood had been pulled out of her. The third clip. Catherine's room at 2 a.m. The door opened. Tessa walked in, and this time Tessa watched herself on the screen, watched herself kneel beside Catherine's bed, watched herself open the thermos, raise spoon after spoon of porridge to the old woman's mouth. Catherine opened her mouth, ate, her eyes brightening, her hand gripping Tessa's wrist. Between spoonfuls, Tessa on the screen wiped Catherine's chin, smoothed her hair, whispered words the camera could not capture, but everyone in the room understood they were gentle words because Catherine's face softened after each one, like someone being lulled to sleep. Then Tessa braided her hair, slowly, carefully, strand by strand, silver hair woven together, and Catherine closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in all the footage Silas had shown. The dining room went numb with silence. Not the tense silence from when Silas had entered, the silence of people who had just been punched in the gut and had not yet found their breath again. The 2 youngest kitchen workers were crying, tears sliding down their cheeks without them bothering to wipe them away. Hugo Pratt stared at the oak tabletop as if he wanted to crawl underneath it. Dolores Vance raised a hand to cover her mouth, her shoulders trembling. Barrett Cole sat rigid, jaw clenched so hard the muscles at his temples stood out. His eyes bloodshot as he stared at the back of Mrs. Pemberton's head, with a look Tessa had never seen on anyone's face. Silas turned off the screen. The room fell back into the chandelier's warm gold light, and the contrast with what they had just watched made everything look unreal, like waking from a nightmare only to realize you were still inside it. "This is Tessa Harlow," Silas said, and his voice shook. Not much, but enough for everyone to hear, and that tremor was more frightening than fury, because Silas Thorne did not shake. The woman accused of stealing. He paused. "She did steal," he continued, his voice clearer now, sharper. "She stole leftovers, bones, cold rice, the things that would be in the trash tomorrow, and she used them to keep my mother alive while the people I trusted, the people I paid, the people I treated like family, were starving her to death." "Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth. Her voice was still astonishingly controlled, or perhaps it was the reflex of 22 years of controlling every situation. "Mr. Thorne, Catherine has dementia. She isn't aware. My mother doesn't have dementia." Silas cut her off. And for the first time tonight, his voice wasn't flat. It was sharp as a blade. "My mother is hungry." Mrs. Pemberton closed her mouth. Not because she had nothing left to say, but because whatever lived in Silas's eyes now did not permit another word. "My mother is dying," Silas said, and his voice broke in the middle. Broke in a way no one in this room had ever heard, in a way no one had ever imagined Silas Thorne could break. Not from old age, not from illness, from hunger, from abuse, from a conspiracy orchestrated by the very woman who had raised me. Silas walked toward Mrs. Pemberton, not in a rush, each step slow, even, precise, like a man counting down the final seconds. Mrs. Pemberton sat motionless in her chair, her back still straight, her chin still lifted, but her eyes had changed. The absolute confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by the quick calculation of a cornered animal weighing whether to bite back or play dead. Silas stopped beside her, looked down, and took her arm, not roughly, not with a jerk, just a grip, firm and impossible to shake off, like steel cuffs wrapped in skin. 22 years. Silas's voice was low, meant only for Mrs. Pemberton and those nearest to hear, yet in the room's absolute silence every word carried to the farthest corner. "You've been in this house for 22 years. You held me at my father's funeral when I was 14. You taught me how to tie a tie. You sat by my bed when I had a fever. And this is what you do." Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth, and her voice still held that calm perfected over decades of controlling every situation. "Mr. Thorne, you don't understand the burden I've carried." Catherine changed after Conrad died. She became difficult, uncooperative, refusing everything. "I was only trying to maintain order in this house, to keep it running while you were busy with bigger matters." "Enough. One word, 2 syllables." Silas didn't shout. He didn't roar. He spoke in that flat, icy tone Tessa imagined he used when he made decisions no one dared question. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth closed mid-sentence, as if someone had cut the sound. Not because she had run out of arguments, but because she realized that all the arguments in the world were meaningless against the eyes looking down at her now. Silas released her arm, turned to face the entire room, and when he spoke again his control was complete. Cold, clear, not a tremor allowed through. "Anyone involved in this, anyone who took part in starving my mother, knew what was happening and stayed silent, or helped cover it up. Stand up, right now. Stand on your own, and you'll leave here on your own feet. The room froze. No one breathed. No one moved. Every second that passed felt heavy as lead. Then Gretchen Marsh stood, slowly, head bowed, shoulders collapsing as if her spine had been pulled out. She didn't look at anyone. She simply stood there, and her rising was like the first stone starting an avalanche. 2 young kitchen workers stood next, almost at the same time, faces bloodless, eyes fixed on the floor. Then Dolores Vance, the assistant housekeeper who had sat beside Mrs. Pemberton through the entire dinner, pushed back her chair and rose. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't speak. Finally, at the far end of the table, one of Silas's 3 lieutenants, the youngest one, stood. Tessa saw Barrett Cole turn to look at him with an expression she could only describe as pure disgust. Silas looked at each person standing, counted them, stored the faces, then drew his phone from his suit pocket with a motion as ordinary as checking a text. Security. His voice on the call was as level as if he were making a dinner reservation. Remove these people from the property. They have 1 hour to collect their personal belongings. After that, if I see any of them within 1 mile of this estate, the consequences will be very clear. He didn't need to say what the consequences were. Everyone in the room understood. The security team appeared from a side door behind the dining room, quick and silent, and Tessa realized they had been waiting there. Everything had been arranged in advance. This dinner, the footage, the timing, the guards waiting behind the door. Silas had known exactly how it would unfold before he ever stepped into the room. Gretchen, Dolores, the 2 kitchen workers, and the young lieutenant were escorted out in silence. They moved like shadows, heads down, no one looking back. But Mrs. Pemberton was different. When 2 security officers reached her, she yanked her arm away. "You have no right to touch me." Her voice went sharp, cracking, stripped of the polished calm she had maintained for 22 years. "I built this house. I kept this family standing when no one else could." No one answered. Security took both her arms and moved her toward the door. "Mrs. Pemberton fought, her shoes scraping the floor, her screaming echoing down the hallway. Accusations tangled with pleading into a chaotic blur of sound, until the dining room doors shut and the stone walls swallowed her voice, farther and farther away, until it vanished. The room felt twice as large after they were gone, empty and heavy, like the air after a storm. Silas stood at the head of the table and looked at those who remained, kitchen staff, house staff, Barrett, and the 2 remaining lieutenants. Their eyes were on him, waiting. "I will make this clear once, and I will not repeat it." Silas's voice had returned to complete calm, cold, hard, without a crack. "My mother is the matriarch of this family. Anyone who harms her, neglects her, or speaks to her without respect will answer directly to me. Do I need to explain further?" A chorus of voices answered across the room, clear and immediate. "Yes, sir. Good. Out. All of you." Chairs scraped stone, footsteps hurried, and the grand dining room emptied like water pulling back. But before the last person crossed the threshold, Silas's voice rose one more time. "Except you, Miss Harlow." The dining room doors closed behind the last person, and the vast room suddenly felt so enormous that Tessa had the strange sensation she was standing in a desert with a ceiling. Only she and Silas Thorne remained. The crystal chandelier high above cast 2 shadows, one at the head of the table, one at the foot, and the distance between them stretched like a sentence. Tessa clasped her hands tight behind her back and braced herself. She didn't know for what exactly, but she braced for everything. For anger because she had known the truth and had not gone straight to him. For punishment because she had entered the West Wing where she had been forbidden. For exile because even if she had saved Catherine, she was still someone who had broken the rules in the home of a man for whom rules were law, and breaking the law had consequences, no matter the reason. She prepared herself to be carrying her suitcase out through the iron gates of the Thorne estate at midnight, back to her car, back to the parking lot, back to the beginning. She prepared for all of it, but she was not prepared for what happened next. Silas Thorne, head of the Thorne Syndicate, the man Chicago feared, the man who ran an empire across the Midwest with an iron hand and instincts that never missed, walked toward her, stopped 2 steps away, and knelt. Both knees touched the stone floor. His back remained straight, but his head bowed. And when he looked up at her, Tessa saw something on that face she was sure no one in Silas Thorne's world had ever been allowed to witness. Tears. "Don't go." His voice was rough, stripped down to bone. No longer cold, no longer controlled, only the pure desperation of a man begging. "Please, I know I have no right to ask. I know what you've endured here, what you've risked. But please don't go." Tessa stood there with her feet rooted to the floor, her mind refusing to process the image in front of her. This man, the one she had feared for 2 months, the one whose reputation alone made the entire staff bow and tremble, was kneeling in front of her. In front of a debt-ridden chef from Texas no one had bothered to remember. My mother is alive because of you, Silas went on, and the tears were running down his face now, unhidden, unwiped, simply falling. You saved her, when I was too blind to see she needed saving. You risked everything, your job, your safety, everything you have, for a stranger, for someone you had no reason to help. I couldn't watch her die and do nothing. Tessa heard her own voice before she had time to think, and it came out gentle and simple. The way truth was always simple. I know. Silas looked up, and in his eyes, red from sleeplessness and crying, Tessa saw real pain. Not the pain of a crime boss, but the pain of a son who had just realized he had nearly let his mother die in the very house he owned. I know you couldn't. That's who you are. That's the kind of person you are. And I am asking you to stay. My mother needs you. He paused, swallowed, and when he spoke again, his voice broke, truly broke. Not a small crack the way it had been earlier, but shattering like glass on stone. I need you to help me fix all of this. Help my mother recover. Teach me how to be the son she deserves. Tessa looked at him, kneeling there, and felt something shift inside her chest. Something she had locked away since the day her mother closed her eyes. Since the day she decided that caring about someone only led to loss, and she had suffered enough loss to last a lifetime. I'm just a cook, she said, and her voice was trembling now too. You can hire doctors, nurses, specialists. They'll care for her far better than I can. She doesn't need doctors. Silas's hands clenched into fists on his thighs, not in anger, but because he was fighting not to collapse completely in the middle of the dining room floor. She needs someone who cares, someone who sees her as a human being, not a burden. Someone who feeds her with gentle hands and braids her hair and sits beside her until she sleeps and treats her with the dignity everyone else stripped away. She needs someone like you. Tessa looked down at Silas Thorne, really looked, and for the first time since she had stepped into this estate, she didn't see a crime boss. She didn't see the man the city feared. She didn't see her employer. She saw a son kneeling on the cold floor of his own home, crying in front of a stranger, begging for help to save his mother because he knew he had failed and he didn't know how to fix it alone. She saw what she had seen in the mirror every day for 14 months in Austin. The fear of losing a mother. I'll stay. Tessa heard herself say it, and it was steadier than she expected. For Catherine, I'll stay and help her get stronger. Silas's face changed, not slowly, instantly, like a light switching on in a dark room. The desperation drained away, replaced by something Tessa could only call pure relief, the relief of someone being thrown a lifeline in open water. Thank you, he said, and those 2 words carried more weight than any speech he had delivered tonight. Thank you. Then Silas stood. He lifted his hand and wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, a gesture so plain it was almost clumsy, and Tessa saw the transition happen right in front of her. His shoulders squared, his jaw hardened, his gaze sharpened again. The desperate son vanished, and the man standing before her now was Silas Thorne, the man who was used to making decisions that changed other people's lives. He slid a hand into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a white envelope. Silas set the envelope on the oak table and slid it toward Tessa. Inside were documents. His voice had returned to calm, but this calm was different from the earlier coldness. It was softer, weighted with gratitude he still didn't know how to say out loud. I had my attorney prepare it. From now on, you have full authority over my mother's care. Medical decisions, daily schedule, diet, who is allowed in her room and who is not. All of it is yours to decide. Everyone in this estate will follow your direction in anything related to my mother. Anyone who questions your judgment will be removed. Tessa stared at the envelope without touching it. She didn't know how she was supposed to react. An hour ago she had stood at the end of the table as the accused, and now she was being handed the power Mrs. Pemberton had held for 2 decades. Your pay will be tripled. Silas continued, practical now, as if reading from a list he'd prepared in advance. A new room right beside the west wing so you can reach my mother at any hour. You will have unrestricted access to the 3rd floor. Anything you need for her care, medical equipment, cooking ingredients, whatever it is, tell Barrett and it will be arranged. He paused. Then his voice changed, lower, slower, and Tessa heard hesitation in it. A strange hesitation in a man she suspected had never hesitated about anything in his life. And one more thing. I added your name to my mother's will. Half of her estate. When she goes, years from now, many years from now, a very long time from now, if you have any say in it, you will be secure for life. Tessa opened her mouth, but Silas raised a hand. I know what you're going to say, and I know it isn't enough. Nothing is enough. There isn't a number. There isn't a property. There isn't anything money can buy that can repay what you did to save my mother's life, but it's what I can offer. It isn't necessary. Tessa finally said, her voice gentle but firm. I didn't do it for money. It is necessary to me. Silas held her gaze, and there were no tears left in his eyes now, but there was something deeper than tears. the determination of a man trying to repair what had broken in the only way he knew. You saved my family, Tessa. The least I can do is make sure you are part of that family. Tessa picked up the envelope. Her fingers touched the paper and felt the weight of the pages inside. The weight of a life being rewritten in ink and notarized signatures. 3 weeks earlier, she had been sitting in her car behind a Walmart with her last $43. Now she was holding documents worth half the fortune of one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. She wanted to say it was too much, that she didn't deserve it, that she had only done what any human being with a conscience would do. But she looked at Silas and understood that for him, this wasn't generosity. It was survival. He was trying to hold on to the last remaining piece of his family, and she was the only person he trusted to help. So instead of refusing, she said the only thing she truly wanted from him: visit her. Silas blinked as if she had asked him a question he hadn't expected. She talks about you constantly, Tessa went on, her voice softening. Every night when I sit beside her, she tells me about you, about the boy who had nightmares, about the son she is prouder of than anything else in the world, about how much she misses you. Silas said nothing. He stood there with his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the oak tabletop, and Tessa understood that his silence now wasn't because he didn't want to speak. It was because he couldn't. She doesn't need your money, Tessa said, gentle but clear. She needs you. Silas nodded, a small nod, slow and heavy, like a man accepting something he had owed for far too long. Then Tessa set the envelope back down on the table, and when she looked up, there was no fear left on her face, no worry about the future, only a simple need more urgent than any paperwork in the world. Can I see her? Now. I want to make sure she's all right after everything tonight. They moved through the Thorne Estates corridors in silence, their footsteps echoing softly on stone, two shadows traveling side by side past tall windows, where moonlight fell in long silver bands across the carpet. The strangest pair this house had ever witnessed. The most powerful crime boss in Chicago, and a debt-burdened chef from Texas, walking together toward the West Wing, as if they had known each other all their lives. When they reached the base of the staircase to the 3rd floor, Silas stopped. His hand settled on the banister, his fingers tightening around the wood, and he stood there for a few seconds before speaking, eyes lifted toward the dark stairs as if he were staring straight into the months he had avoided. I didn't do my duty as a son. His voice was small, stripped of the authority he had carried all night, leaving only the naked honesty of a man facing his own failure. I let fear hold me back, afraid to watch her grow weaker, afraid to sit beside the bed and watch the strongest woman I have ever known disappear a little more every day. So I stayed away. I handed her to other people and told myself I was handling bigger things. He swallowed. I almost let her die because I was too cowardly to face her illness. Tessa placed her hand on his arm. Gentle, brief, just enough to let him know she was there. You're here now. That's what matters. Silas looked at her, nodded, and went up the stairs. They stopped at Catherine's door. Silas set his hand on the knob, drew a deep breath, and turned it. The room was flooded with moonlight from a large window facing Lake Michigan. Catherine sat propped against the pillows, an open book on her lap, a small bedside lamp casting warm gold over her silver hair. She looked up at the sound of the door, and her gray eyes met her son's. Everything in her face stopped. The book slid from her lap onto the blanket without her noticing. Silas, her voice trembled, thin and fragile, uncertain, as if she were looking at a mirage, and afraid that if she spoke louder, it would disappear. Hi, Mom. Silas crossed the room, each step faster than the last, until he dropped to his knees beside the bed and took Catherine's frail hand in both of his. His hands were big, rough, scarred, enclosing hers the way you would cradle a small bird. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Catherine's other hand rose, trembling, to touch Silas's face. Her fingers traced the scar running from his temple down his cheekbone, brushed the dark hollows beneath his eyes, touched the tears sliding down his skin, and she touched her son with the tenderness of a mother who had waited too long for a moment like this. You know now. Her whisper trembled. I know everything, and I've handled it. You're safe now. I promise you. You're safe. Catherine drew Silas's head into her chest, and the most powerful man in Chicago folded into his mother the way a 14-year-old boy once had at his father's funeral. Mother and son held each other and cried, and the room filled with a sound Tessa recognized better than anyone. The sound of love that had almost been destroyed, stitching itself back together. Piece by piece, Tessa stepped back toward the door to give them privacy. This was their moment, not hers. She was only the cook. She had only happened to hear crying through an air vent, and she hadn't been able to turn away. But Catherine lifted her head, saw Tessa retreating, and reached out, fingers thin as twigs, yet they clamped around Tessa's wrist with a strength no one would have guessed remained in that frail body, and she pulled Tessa closer. My 2 children. Catherine's voice was fierce even through tears. Fierce in the way only mothers who have walked through hell can be fierce. My 2 children together. This is all I want." Tessa was about to say she wasn't Catherine's daughter, that she wasn't family, that she was only a stranger who had walked in at the right moment. But Silas's eyes met hers over Catherine's shoulder, and he gave a small shake of his head, one small gesture. But it said everything. Let her have this. Let all of us have this. Tessa stayed. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Catherine held her hand with one hand, held Silas's hand with the other, and kept them both close with the grip of someone hauled up from the bottom of a ravine who refused to let go of anything keeping her from falling again. Moonlight from Lake Michigan poured through the window, laying a soft silver veil over the three people in the room. Catherine drifted toward sleep. Her breathing slowed, steadied, her eyes closed, and her face became peaceful. Not the resignation of someone abandoned, but the true calm of someone who was loved. Yet even in sleep, she still held them both tightly. Silas sat still, eyes on his mother, and said nothing. Tessa sat still too, and in that quiet moment, fleeting as a breath, she thought of her own mother, of Margaret, of her mother's hand holding hers on the last night in Austin, of the promise she had whispered beside the bed, "I'll be all right, Mom." She had not been all right. For the past year, she had only existed, not lived. She moved, breathed, ate, slept. But something inside her had gone dark the night her mother closed her eyes. Then she let the thought go, gently, like releasing a leaf onto moving water, not forgetting, not erasing, only letting it float. Because sitting here, in this moonlit room, Catherine's hand in hers, Silas beside her, she found what she had lost on the day her mother died. Purpose. For the first time since she walked through the iron gates of the Thorne estate, Tessa felt something other than fear. She felt, impossibly, like she had come home. This story reminds all of us of something simple and profound. Sometimes kindness does not have to be grand. Sometimes it is only a bowl of porridge cooked at 3 o'clock in the morning from ingredients no one else bothers to notice. Sometimes the person who saves us is not a hero in armor, but an ordinary woman with trembling hands and a heart that refuses to turn away. And sometimes the strongest thing is not standing at the top of power, but kneeling down to admit you were wrong. In real life, how many Catherines are quietly suffering around us? How many faint cries slip through the vents because no one is willing to listen? And how many Tessas, ordinary people, are doing the right thing in silence, even when no one sees, even when no one says thank you? Let this be a reminder that you should never underestimate the power of a heart that knows how to love. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss moving stories every day. And we would truly love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your real life? Leave a comment below and share what's on your heart, because every comment you leave is a powerful source of motivation that helps us keep bringing meaningful stories to you. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.